Kill her quietly. I want no scandal clinging to my crown when I take Seraphine to the altar." The voice belonged to the man who had bound his soul to hers beneath a harvest moon, and the words slid into Rena Calomere like a blade of winter iron. She stood frozen behind the carved oak door of the war room, one palm flattened against the wood, and she felt the mate bond that had lived warm in her chest for 7 years go suddenly, brutally cold. It did not break gently. It tore. A phantom rope snapped somewhere beneath her ribs, and she pressed her hand harder to her mouth to keep from making a sound. Because if she made a sound, they would open the door, and if they opened the door, the order would be carried out tonight instead of tomorrow. She had come to bring him tea. That was the absurdity of it, the small domestic detail that would haunt her for months. A steaming cup of chamomile and mountain honey, the way he liked it after long council sessions, cooling now in her trembling grip. She had walked the length of the fortress corridor, thinking of nothing more than the softness she might coax from him, the tired smile he sometimes gave only her. Instead, she had arrived to hear King Draven Thornwald, alpha of the Ironmoor pack, sovereign of 3 valleys and 11 bloodlines, calmly arranging her death as though scheduling a hunt. "She served her purpose," Seraphine's honeyed voice answered, and Rena heard the smile in it. The alliance with the Eastern Packs held only because of her father's name. Her father is dead now. She is a debt you no longer owe. A debt. 7 years of her life reduced to a line in a ledger. Rena's knees threatened to fold, and she let them bend, sinking silently to the cold stone floor, the teacup finally slipping from her fingers to shatter against the base of the wall. She caught it too late to stop the fall, but soon enough to muffle the worst of the sound with her skirts. Inside, the conversation continued, unbroken. They had not heard. They were too enraptured with the shape of their future to notice the destruction of hers. "Make it look like grief," Draven said. "A wandering wolf out past the ridge. An accident. She goes riding alone often enough that no one will question it. Have Corvin see to it. He owes me, and he doesn't ask questions." Corvin, his own captain of the guard. The man who had taught Rena to hold a blade when she first arrived at Ironmoor as a frightened girl of 19, sent north to seal a treaty with her body and her name. She had trusted Corvin. She had trusted all of them. And now she knelt on the floor of the fortress she had spent 7 years learning to call home, listening to the men she loved plan the disposal of her corpse. Something inside her that had been soft for a very long time turned to stone. She did not weep. Later she would marvel at that, at the way grief can curdle so fast into something colder and more useful. She rose from the floor without a sound, gathered the shattered porcelain into the fold of her skirt, so no servant would find it and gossip, and walked back down the corridor with a spine held so straight it ached. Every step was a decision. Every step was a refusal. They wanted her dead and disappeared, a grief-shaped hole in the king's calendar. She would not give them the courtesy of a body to bury. In her chambers, she set the broken cup on the window-sill and looked at herself in the tall silver mirror Draven had gifted her on their first anniversary. A pale woman looked back, dark hair loose about her shoulders, eyes the color of storm light. The queen consort of Ironmoor, the woman who had negotiated the grain treaties that kept 3 valleys from starving through the bad winter. The woman who had drafted the border accords, who had learned the ledgers of the treasury better than the treasurer, who had memorized the names of every soldier's child so she could ask after them by name. All of it invisible to the man who had just called her a debt. "He thinks I am nothing," she whispered to the mirror. "Let me show him what nothing can build." That single line, spoken to her own reflection in an empty room, became the spine of everything that followed. She did not scream it. She did not weep it. She simply set it down inside herself like a foundation stone, and then she began to plan. Because Rena Callowmere had always been 3 moves ahead of the men who underestimated her, and they had just given her the greatest advantage of all. They believed her already dead. She had until tomorrow. Corvin would come at dusk, when she rode the eastern ridge as she always did. That gave her 1 night and most of a day to become a ghost. She sat at her writing desk, lit a single candle, and began, with steady hands, to list everything she would need and everyone she could not trust, which was nearly everyone, and the short, precious list of those she could. The candle burned low as she worked, and outside her window the moon rose over the black spires of Ironmoor, the same moon that had witnessed her binding to a man who now wanted her dead. She didn't look at it. She had wasted enough of her life looking up at things that would not save her. From now on, Rena decided she would look only forward, and she would build, brick by patient brick, a height from which the whole of Ironmoor would one day have to look up at her. She began where any careful woman begins when she is planning to vanish, with money, and with the truth of who could be bought and who could not. Over 7 years, Rena had learned that a crown is heavy, but that gold is light and travels well, and she had been quietly, patiently preparing for a day she had prayed would never come. Not this exact day, not this specific betrayal, but some version of it, because a woman married for her name learns early that names can be discarded when the alliance they seal grows inconvenient. She had watched her own mother discarded so. She had promised herself she would not be caught unprepared. Behind the false back of her wardrobe, sewn into the lining of a travelling cloak she had never worn, were 40 gold sovereigns and a cache of unset gemstones she had accumulated over years by the simple expedient of underspending the allowance the treasury granted the Queen and pocketing the difference in forms that could not be traced. It was not a fortune. It was not the treasury of Ironmoor, but it was enough to run on, enough to start on, and crucially it was hers, earned and hidden and belonging to no man. She would take none of his gifts, not the silver mirror, not the ropes of river pearls, not the ceremonial dagger with the thorn-walled crest worked into the hilt. Those belonged to the Queen Consort, and Rena intended that the Queen Consort should die on schedule tomorrow, riding the eastern ridge, so that no one would think to look for a living woman. She laid the pearls out on the pillow beside the wedding ring, the great heavy band of white gold that had never fit quite right, and she felt nothing looking at them but a distant, clinical satisfaction. Let him find them there. Let him understand, when the time came, that she had left them behind, not because she forgot them, but because she refused them. There was one person in the fortress she trusted, and it was not Corvin, and it was not any of the glittering courtiers who had bowed to her for 7 years. It was old Maven, the kennel mistress, a stooped woman with hands like tree roots, who had never once in 7 years called Rena anything but child. Maven had lost her own daughter to a border raid the year before Rena arrived, and something in the girl queen had filled a space in the old woman's grief, and something in the old woman had steadied the frightened girl. They had never spoken of it. They had simply been kind to each other in the small daily ways that build, over years, into something unbreakable. Rena went to the kennels in the deepest part of the night, moving through the servants' passages she had memorized long ago, and she found Maven awake, as she always was, sitting with a bitch that was whelping in the corner stall. The old woman looked up, took one glance at Rena's face, and knew. "So it's come," Maven said quietly. "The way it came for the last one." "There was a last one," Rena said. It was not a question. Before your time, a northern girl, married for a treaty, set aside when the treaty rotted. She rode out one morning and never came back, and they mourned her prettily and married him off again within the season. Maven's gnarled hands never stopped their gentle work on the labouring dog. I always wondered if the wolf that took her had 2 legs. The confirmation settled over Rena like cold water. There was a pattern here, older than her own grief, a machine that had eaten women before her and would eat women after, unless someone broke it. "I need to leave tonight," she said, "before dawn, and I need everyone to believe I died tomorrow on the ridge." Maven nodded slowly, as though Rena had asked her to fetch water. "The grey mare," she said. "Windfall. She's sure-footed, and she's fast, and she knows the deer paths through the northern wood better than any rider. I'll saddle her myself, and I'll walk her out through the culling gate, where the night guard is my sister's boy, and he'll look the other way for me." She paused. "And tomorrow, when they find your riding cloak torn and blooded at the base of the ridge, and a scattering of your dark hair caught on the bramble, and the mare gone as if bolted, they'll grieve you prettily and marry him off again within the season, and you'll be 100 miles gone." Rena stared at her. "You've thought about this?" "Child, I've been thinking about it since the day you arrived." The old woman finally looked up, and her eyes were wet, but her voice was iron. "I could not save the last one. I did not know her in time, but I have known you 7 years, and I will be damned before I let this place swallow you the way it swallowed her." They worked through the last dark hours together. Maven cut a lock of Rena's hair, and Rena herself, with a steady hand that surprised her, took the ceremonial dagger and made a shallow cut on her own forearm, enough to bloody the discarded riding cloak convincingly, because the wolves of Ironmoor could smell a lie, and only real blood would sell the story. Maven bound the wound with practiced care. They tore the cloak, scattered the hair, arranged the small tableau of a queen's violent death at the base of the eastern ridge in the pre-dawn dark while the fortress slept, and then they walked the grey mare out through the culling gate, and Maven's sister's boy studied the middle distance with great concentration, and saw nothing at all. At the edge of the northern wood, where the deer path swallowed the trail, Rena stopped and turned. The fortress was a black shape against a greying sky, and she looked at it for the last time as the woman she had been. "Thank you," she said to Maven, and the words were wholly inadequate. "Don't thank me," the old woman said. "Live. Live loud enough that someday word of it reaches back here, and let it be the loudest thing this place has ever heard. That's all the thanks I want." She pressed something into Rena's palm, a small folded square of oiled leather. "A name and a place. Caliph, at the trading city of Harogate, 3 days south and west. He owes me a debt older than you are, and he collects for a living, which means he knows how to move a person who doesn't want to be found. Tell him Maven of the Kennels sends her marker. He'll do the rest." Then the old woman stepped back, and Rena touched her heels to Windfall's flanks, and the grey mare carried her into the trees, into the dark, into the unmarked country where a dead queen might find out what a living woman could become. She did not look back a second time. Behind her, the machine that had eaten women for generations ground on, unaware that this time it had swallowed something with teeth. The trading city of Harogate was nothing like Ironmoor. Where the fortress had been all cold stone and ceremony, Harogate was warmth and noise, and the reek of 100 trades crammed into narrow streets, a free city that answered to no pack and no king, governed by a council of merchant houses whose only shared religion was profit. Renna arrived on the 4th day, footsore and hollow-eyed, having sold Windfall for far less than the mare was worth to a horse trader outside the walls, because a grey mare of Ironmoor breeding was a thread someone might one day pull. She walked into the city on foot, one more traveller among thousands. Her queen's carriage burned to ash behind her. Calith, when she found him, was not what she expected. She had imagined some hard-eyed smuggler, and instead she found a soft-spoken man of middle years running a scrivener's shop that dealt in contracts, debts, and the quiet transfer of monies between parties who preferred not to meet. When she said the words, "Maven of the Kennels sends her marker," something old and complicated crossed his face, and he closed the shop, and he listened to her story without a single interruption, and at the end of it, he was quiet for a long time. "She saved my sister once," he said finally. "Maven. Long ago, in another life, before I was respectable. I have been waiting 20 years to repay a debt I thought I'd never be asked to honor." He looked at Renna with new attention, reassessing. "You negotiated the Eastern Grain Treaties. I've seen the terms. They were elegant. Whoever drafted them understood leverage better than most of the men who sit on our council." "I drafted them," Renna said. "I know," Calith said. "That's why I said it." He folded his hands. "You don't want to disappear, do you?" "Not really. A woman who wanted only to disappear would have run further and asked for less. You want to build something." She met his eyes. "I want to build something so large that the man who threw me away has to negotiate with me one day, and doesn't know it's me until the ink is dry. And then I want him to understand exactly what he traded, and exactly what it cost him, and I want the understanding to be the whole of my revenge. Because I have decided I will not soil my hands with his blood the way he was willing to soil his with mine. I will beat him with what he claimed I didn't have. I'll beat him with worth." Calith smiled then, the slow smile of a man who has just recognized a rare and valuable thing. "Then you've come to the right city," he said. "Here, a person is only worth what they can build. No one will ask who your father was. No one will care what pack you were born to. They'll only ask what you can do." He rose and turned the sign in his shop window. "Let's find out what you can do." 6 months later, Renna Calomere was dead, and a woman named Ren Ashvain had begun, quietly, to remake the trade of an entire city. She had started small, as all foundations start, with a single contract that Calith had thrown her way, half as a test. A dispute between 2 spice houses over a shipment lost to bandits. A knot of blame and counterclaim that had tied up the courts for a year. Ren had read every document in an afternoon, walked the trade route in her mind, identified the single overlooked clause in the original agreement that made the whole thing collapse in favor of the smaller house, and drafted a settlement so clean that both parties signed it within the week, each convinced they had won. Calith had stared at the finished document, and then at her, and had stopped treating her as a debt to be discharged, and started treating her as a partner to be kept. From there, it built the way a fire builds, slowly and then all at once. Ren had a gift the city prized above all others. She could look at a tangle of competing interests and see the shape of the deal that would satisfy everyone enough to hold. She understood, in a way that could not be taught, that the strongest agreements were not the ones that beat an opponent into submission, but the ones that gave each party a reason to keep their word. She had learned this, she sometimes thought bitterly, from watching how badly Draven Thornwall did the opposite, ruling through fear and favor and the constant threat of withdrawal, until the only loyalty he commanded was the loyalty of the frightened. She took none of the credit publicly at first. She worked through Calith's house, letting him present the settlements she drafted, building her reputation in the shadows where no whisper of a dead northern queen could reach. But within 4 months, the merchant houses had begun to notice that Calith's contracts had acquired an uncanny reliability, and they began to ask who was really drafting them. And Calith, who was an honest man in the ways that mattered, told them the truth. A woman named Ren Ashvane, and if they wanted her, they would deal with her directly, and they would pay her rate. They paid her rate. Within 6 months, she had her own rooms above a chandler's shop, a clientele that included 3 of the 7 great houses, and something she had not had in 7 years of queenship. Her own money, her own name, her own worth, unmortgaged to any man's goodwill. She woke each morning in a small, bright room that smelled of tallow and river air. And for the first time since she was 19 years old, she did not wake to the question of whether she had pleased anyone. She woke to her own work. The northern news reached her slowly, filtered through the trade routes that carried gossip alongside grain. King Dreven had mourned his queen with a great state funeral, an empty coffin lowered into the royal crypt with a lock of dark hair inside it, and Ren had felt a strange vertigo reading the account, the sensation of attending her own burial. Within the season, precisely as Maven had predicted, he had wed Seraphine Vale in a ceremony said to have cost half a year's treasury, and the Eastern Pax, whose loyalty had been bound by Renna's father's name and Renna's own patient diplomacy, had sent no representatives at all. The alliance she had held together with both hands for 7 years had begun, the instant her hands were gone, to come apart. She might have felt vindicated. Instead, she felt only a cold, precise interest, the interest of a physician reading the chart of a patient she already knew was dying. Because Ren understood the machine of Ironmoor better than anyone alive, she could read the coming collapse in the small signs that others missed, and she began, quietly, to position herself along its fault lines. Not to push it over. She did not need to push. She only needed to be standing in the right place, holding the right instruments, when the whole edifice came down of its own rotten weight. Calith found her one evening bent over a map of the northern trade routes, marking the flow of grain and iron and salt with a precision that had nothing to do with any contract on their books. He set a cup of wine beside her and studied the map over her shoulder for a long moment before he spoke. "You're not planning a settlement," he said. "You're planning a siege." "I'm planning nothing," Ren said. "I'm reading. Look here." She tapped the eastern valleys. "Ironmoor doesn't grow enough grain to feed its own soldiers through winter. It never has. That's why the eastern treaties mattered so much, why my father's names mattered, why I spent 7 years keeping those packs sweet. The grain flows west from the eastern valleys, through Ironmoor's granaries, out to the border garrisons. Cut the flow, and by midwinter the king can't feed his army, and the eastern packs have already stopped sending representatives to court. They're testing him. They're waiting to see if the man who threw away his queen can hold together what she built. And can he? No, Ren said simply. He rules through fear, and fear is expensive. It works only as long as you can afford the demonstrations that renew it. The moment his soldiers go hungry, the fear turns to resentment, and resentment is a fire he can't put out with the tools he has. She sat back. He doesn't understand grain. He never did. He understood strength, and he thought strength was the whole of power. He's about to learn the difference. Calith was quiet a moment. You could simply let it happen. Sit here, safe and rich, and read about his ruin the way you read about your own funeral. I could. Ren turned to look at him. But there are people in those valleys who will starve while two proud fools contest a crown. The soldiers have children. I know their names. I asked after their children for 7 years. Something hardened in her voice. I did not survive being thrown away in order to become a woman who watches children starve to make a point. So no, I won't simply let it happen. I'll do what I always did. I'll fix it. Only this time I'll be paid my worth, and this time the man who called me a debt will have to come to me on his knees to get it. And so the long game began in earnest. Ren went to the Eastern Pax, not as the dead queen, but as Ren Ashvain, master negotiator of Harogate, sent by the Free Cities Merchant Council to secure grain contracts in a time of uncertainty. She sat across the table from lords who had bowed to her at her wedding and didn't recognize the confident, plainly dressed woman of business who spoke their own interests back to them more clearly than they could articulate them themselves. She had changed in 6 months more than she had understood. Grief and freedom had recarved her face into something harder and cleaner, and the courtiers had never truly looked at the queen anyway, had never seen past the crown to the woman wearing it. It was, she reflected, the final insult and the final gift. They had made her so invisible that her invisibility was now impenetrable armor. She built the Eastern Pax a new market. That was the elegant heart of it, the move that Calith called the finest piece of tradecraft he had seen in 30 years. Instead of shipping their grain west through Ironmore's granaries, where the king could tax it and control it and use it as a leash, Ren opened a southern route through Harogate, brokered by the Free City, sold at fair prices to a dozen buyers who could never squeeze the eastern lords the way a single desperate king could. She gave them something Draven never had: independence, options, the dignity of not needing him. And in doing so, she quietly, methodically, cut the artery that fed Ironmore's power, not with a blade, but with a better offer. By the time the first frost came to the northern valleys, King Draven Thornwald's granaries stood half empty, and his eastern allies had grown mysteriously prosperous and mysteriously unwilling to renew the old arrangements. His treasury, drained by a lavish wedding and a lavish reign, could not afford to buy grain on the open market at the prices the open market now demanded, prices set, though he did not know it, by a woman he had ordered killed. His soldiers grumbled, his new queen spent, and the machine that had eaten women for generations began, for the first time, to eat itself. The perspective from inside the fortress was one of slow, bewildered ruin. Draven could not understand what was happening to him. He was still strong. His wolves were still fierce. He had won every battle he had ever fought. And yet the ground was disappearing beneath him inch by inch, and every solution he reached for turned to sand in his grip. When the Eastern Lords refused his summons, he raged and threatened, and the threats, which had always worked before, now merely accelerated their departure, because they no longer needed him, and a man who does not understand that his leash has been cut only looks foolish tugging on it. Seraphine, who had been so magnificent as a prize, proved worthless as a partner. She knew how to be admired and nothing else. When Draven brought her the ledgers in desperation, hoping for the quick, clear counsel his first queen had always provided, she looked at the columns of figures with blank incomprehension and suggested a feast to raise morale. She did not know the names of the soldiers' children. She did not know how to soothe an offended lord or thread a treaty through a needle's eye of competing prides. She had been chosen because she was beautiful and because her family was powerful, and now her family, sensing the tide, had begun to distance itself from a king whose crown was tarnishing, and Draven found himself alone in a marriage that was itself only another failing alliance. It was Corvin who first spoke the unspeakable. The captain of the guard, the man who had been ordered to arrange a queen's murder, and had, to his lasting private shame, agreed, came to the king one grey afternoon in the emptying war room where it had all begun. "The eastern grain," he said. "It's being brokered through Harogate. A single house has cornered the northern trade, a trader named Ashvane." "Then buy them," Draven snapped. "Buy the house, buy the trader. Everyone has a price." "We've tried, sire." Corvin's face was grim. "The trader won't sell and won't be bought, won't even take a meeting with our factors. The only way to secure the winter grain is to go to Harogate in person and negotiate directly, king to council as a supplicant." He let the word land. "There's no other way to feed the garrisons before the snows close the passes." The silence in the war room was long and cold. Draven Thornwald, Alpha King of Ironmoor, who had never in his life asked another soul for anything he could not simply take, understood at last that he was going to have to beg. And so, as the first snow began to fall over the black spires, the king rode south to the free city of Harogate with a small retinue and a large humiliation, to plead for the grain that would keep his crown on his head through the winter. He did not know that he was riding toward the woman whose death he had ordered. He did not know that the ghost he had buried with a lock of her own hair was waiting for him at the end of the road, holding everything he needed and owing him nothing at all. Ren knew he was coming. She had known for weeks. The trade routes carried gossip faster than any king could ride, and Calith's network had reported the moment Draven's retinue passed the southern watchtowers. She had time to prepare, and she used it, not to plan a cruelty, but to arrange a stage, because she had decided long ago that her revenge would be served not with a knife, but with the simple, devastating fact of her own success made undeniable, made impossible to look away from, made his to negotiate with. She dressed with care on the morning of the meeting, not in the finery of a queen. Those days were dead and buried in a crypt in the north. She dressed as what she was, a master of the free city's most powerful trade house, in clean dark wool and a coat the colour of stormlight, her dark hair bound back in a plain severe style that framed a face grown lean and certain. No jewels, no crown, only competence worn like armour. She looked at herself in the small mirror of her chambers, a far humbler glass than the silver one she had left behind, and she saw a woman she was not ashamed of, a woman who had built every single thing she stood on with her own 2 hands, and she felt the old, cold clarity settle over her like a familiar cloak. The council chamber of Harogate was a wide, bright room of pale wood and tall windows, so different from the war room of Ironmoor that the contrast itself made a kind of statement. Ren had arranged that the northern delegation would be received first by the council's factors, kept waiting in the manner of any petitioner, and then brought before the single trader who controlled the grain they needed. She sat at the head of a long table, with her back to the tall windows, so that the winter light would fall on the faces of those who entered, while leaving her own in shadow. A small theatrical touch she had learned from a lifetime of watching men use rooms as weapons. Calith stood at her right hand. The great houses had sent observers, curious to see the northern king humbled, and they lined the walls in expensive silence. The doors opened, and Draven Thornwald walked into the room. 6 months and a hard winter had marked him. He was still a powerful man, broad and grim, the king's bearing still in the set of his shoulders, but there was a strain around his eyes that had not been there before, the strain of a man whose certainties had begun to fail him. He crossed the bright room toward the shadowed figure at the head of the table, already composing the words of a proud man forced to ask, already resenting the asking, and he did not look closely at the trader's face because he did not expect to need to. She was an obstacle to be overcome, a merchant to be maneuvered, nothing more. "I am King Draven Thornwald of Ironmoor," he said. "I've come to secure the northern grain contracts. I'm told you control them." "I do," Ren said. He heard the voice before he saw the face, and Ren watched the exact moment the ground opened beneath him. She watched the word he had been about to speak die on his lips. She watched his eyes finally, truly focus on the woman at the head of the table, watched them travel her features and reject what they saw, and then be forced, second by terrible second, to accept it. The color drained from his face the way it had drained from hers in the corridor 6 months ago, and she felt no triumph in it, only a cold, complete symmetry, as though a debt had finally been entered correctly in a ledger long kept wrong. "Renna." Her name came out of him in a broken whisper. You're dead. We buried you. I buried you." "You buried a lock of hair and an empty box," Ren said, and her voice was perfectly level, perfectly calm, the composed calm she had promised herself she would never surrender to his fury. "The queen you ordered killed is dead, Your Majesty. I let her die on the eastern ridge exactly as you arranged, because a dead woman is so much freer than a live one who is owned. My name is Ren Ashvane. I control the grain that will feed your soldiers this winter, and you have come 3 days south to beg it from me on your knees, though you didn't know until this moment whose knees you'd be begging at." The room was utterly silent. The observers along the walls did not breathe. Draven stood swaying slightly. A king turned suddenly to a man, and behind the shock in his eyes, Ren watched a second thing dawn, slower and heavier than the first. Understanding. Understanding of what he had done, and of what it had cost him, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, terrible arithmetic of the moment. The starving garrisons, the vanished allies, the empty granaries, all of it flowing from the single order he had given in a war room, casual as scheduling a hunt. She watched him understand that the woman he had discarded as a debt had been the whole foundation of everything he ruled, and that he had kicked it out from under himself with his own foot. "Corvin," Draven said hoarsely, not turning, as though he needed to say the name aloud to be sure the world had not entirely inverted. "Corvin was to. Corvin never touched me," Ren said. "I was gone before dusk the night you gave the order. I heard you, Draven. I stood behind the war room door with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, and I heard you tell Seraphine that I had served my purpose. I heard you call me a debt you no longer owed." She let the words hang. "So I paid myself out. And then I built something worth more than everything you have, and I did it in 6 months, alone, with nothing but the coin I'd saved from an allowance you thought I spent on ribbons. You said I was nothing." She rose from her chair, slowly, and the winter light fell across her at last, and every soul in that room saw the queen they had never known they were looking at. "This is what nothing built." Draven fell to his knees. Not in supplication first, but in something closer to collapse, the weight of comprehension finally exceeding what his legs could bear. And then, when he was already down, the supplication came, because he had no other move left. "The grain," he said. "My people, the soldiers, they'll starve without it. Whatever you want, whatever price, name it. I'll pay anything." And here was the moment Ren had turned over in her mind 100 times, on 100 sleepless nights. The moment she could have crushed him utterly, could have let his garrison starve and his crown fall, and watched the machine that ate women finally devour its own maker. she had earned that. No one in the room, knowing what he had done, would have blamed her for it. But she had promised herself something in front of a silver mirror 6 months ago, and she had kept every promise she had made since, and she would keep this one too. "I'll sell you the grain," she said, "at a fair price. My people in those valleys will not starve to feed my pride, and neither will your soldiers' children, whose names I still remember even if you never learned them. But the terms are mine, and they are not negotiable, and you will sign them exactly as written, or you will ride home empty-handed and explain to your court why." She slid a document down the length of the table. Calith had drafted it to her specifications, and it was a masterpiece of quiet dominance. The grain contracts run through Harogate permanently. Ironmore no longer controls the northern trade. It merely buys at the market rate like everyone else. The eastern packs deal directly with the free city, their independence guaranteed by treaty, so that no king may ever again hold a valley's food over its head as a leash. And the practice of marrying women for treaties and disposing of them when the treaty's sour ends. It ends today, in writing, enforced by the withdrawal of every contract I control the instant it's violated. You built a machine that eats women, Draven. I'm dismantling it, and you're going to sign the order for its destruction with your own hand." He stared at the document. He was still strong. He was still a king. He could refuse, and ride home, and watch his crown fall by spring, or he could sign, and live, and know for the rest of his life exactly what he had thrown away, and exactly who now held the leash he had thought was his. She watched him understand that there was no version of this where he won, that the woman he had underestimated had built a checkmate so complete that his only remaining choice was the manner of his defeat. "Why?" he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Why offer terms at all? Why not just let me fall? You have every reason." "Because I'm not you," Ren said simply. "You measured my worth by what I could do for you, and when you thought I could do no more, you ordered me killed. I measure worth differently. I measure it by what a person builds, and whether they keep their word, and whether they let children starve to win a fight. By that measure I am worth a great deal more than you, and I intend to keep it that way." She held out a pen. "Sign, Draven." "Duty calls, Your Majesty." He signed. His hand shook, but he signed, every clause, and with each stroke of the pen the leash passed more completely into her hands, and when it was done, he set down the pen and looked up at her with an expression she had waited 6 months to see and found, in the event, gave her far less satisfaction than she had imagined, and far more peace. It was the face of a man who understood, fully and finally, the enormity of what he had lost, and who knew that no strength he possessed could ever win it back. Word of what had happened in the council chamber of Harogate travelled north faster than the king's own retinue. It reached the fortress before he did, and it reached in time the kennels, where an old woman with hands like tree roots heard from her sister's boy that the dead queen was alive and had brought the Alpha King to his knees in a free city 3 days south, and Maven of the kennels sat down on an overturned bucket and wept, and then she laughed, and then she went to tell the whelping bitch in the corner stall that the child had lived loud after all, exactly as she'd been told to. Seraphine did not survive the collapse of the arrangement. When it became clear that Draven had ceded the northern trade, and that Ironmore was now merely one buyer among many, her powerful family, which had wed her to a king and expected a king's returns, quietly withdrew its support and began negotiating her release from a marriage that no longer served them. She left the fortress within the season, as decorative and as hollow at her departure as she had been at her arrival, and the court that had fawned over her forgot her, with the speed reserved for those whose only currency was proximity to power. She had been the antagonist's mistake, given human shape, and when the mistake was fully understood, she simply ceased to matter, which was perhaps the cruelest fate of all for a woman who had never learned to matter for anything but her face. Draven Thornwald ruled on, diminished. He kept his crown because Ren had allowed him to keep it, fed his soldiers because she had sold him the grain to do it, and lived out his reign as a lesser king in a world reshaped by the woman he had thrown away. It was said that he never remarried, that he kept on his desk a document signed in his own shaking hand, and that he read it sometimes, in the long northern nights, the way a man reads his own sentence. Whether that was penance or merely regret, Ren neither knew nor greatly cared. She had extracted from him the only thing she wanted, which was not his suffering, but his acknowledgement, written and binding and permanent, that her worth had never been his to grant or to take away. She did not go north again. There was nothing there for her, no throne she wanted back, no man she wished to face a second time. Ironmoor had been a cage disguised as a crown, and she had learned the difference between the two the hard way, on the cold stone floor of a war room with a teacup shattering at her feet. Some people, having escaped a cage, spend the rest of their lives circling it, unable to stop looking at the bars. Ren was not one of them. She had built a new life in the bright, warm chaos of Harogate, and it was better than the old one in every way that mattered, and she intended to live in it fully rather than haunt the ruins of what she had left behind. But she did send for Maven. The letter went north through Calith's network, carried by a rider who knew how to move a person who did not wish to be found, and it contained no title and no summons, only an invitation written in the plain hand of a woman to the one person in all the world who had loved her enough to help her die. "Come south," it said. "There is a warm room here with your name on it, and a whole city that has never once made you bow to anyone, and an old woman who taught a frightened girl to survive deserves to spend her last years being the one who is looked after for a change. Windfall is here too. I found her, and I brought her back, and she remembers the deer paths even now. Come home, Maven. I built a home worth having, and it is not complete without you in it." The old woman came. She arrived at the end of a hard journey, looking smaller and greyer than Ren remembered, but her eyes were the same iron, and when she stepped down from the cart and saw Ren waiting for her in the bright street, dressed in dark wool and standing straight and free, she did not weep this time. She simply took the younger woman's face in her tree-root hands and studied it for a long moment. "There she is," Maven said. "Not the queen. Her. The one I always saw under the crown. You found her." "You found her," Ren said. "You saw her before I did. You walked her out through the culling gate in the dark." She covered the old woman's hands with her own. "I owe you everything, Maven. Everything I built stands on the night you decided not to let this place swallow me. You owe me nothing, child. I told you what I wanted. You lived loud. I heard it all the way north." The old woman smiled, and the years fell away from her face for just a moment. The whole fortress heard it. The whole world heard it. There has never been a louder living in all my long life, and I got to be the one who lit the match. That's payment enough for 10 lifetimes. They walked together through the streets of the free city, the old kennel mistress and the master of the greatest trade house in Harogate, and Ren showed her the rooms above the chandler's shop that had grown into a suite of offices, and the warehouses along the river where the northern grain flowed through on its way to 12 honest buyers, and the small stable at the edge of the city where a grey mare lifted her head and whickered at the sound of a familiar step. Maven pressed her forehead to Windfall's neck and stood there a long time, and neither of them said anything, because some things are too large for words and are better spoken in the silence between two people who understand each other. The years that followed were the fullest of Wren's life. She never took a crown again, and she never wanted one. She had learned that a title granted by another could be revoked by another, and that the only power worth having was the kind you built yourself, brick by patient brick, on a foundation no one could kick out from under you. She built exactly that. Her trade house grew until it shaped the commerce of half a continent, and she used its weight the way she had always used her gifts, not to crush but to hold, threading agreements through the needle's eye of competing prides, keeping valleys fed and children safe and treaties honest, and everywhere her hand fell, the machines that ate the weak to feed the strong ground quietly to a halt. There was, in time, a partner, not a rescuer, for she had rescued herself and had no need of another. Calith's network had brought her into contact with a shipwright named Toran Vess, a broad, quiet man who built the vessels that carried her grain down the southern rivers, and who respected her the way she had always deserved to be respected, for the sharpness of her mind and the reliability of her word, rather than for any name or crown or use she could be put to. He did not fall in love with a queen. There was no queen left to love. He fell in love with Ren Ashvane, the trader who could see the shape of a deal that would hold, the woman who remembered the names of the children in the valleys she fed, and she who had sworn in the cold clarity of her grief that she would never again bind her worth to any man's goodwill, found that a bond freely chosen between equals was a different thing entirely from a bond imposed by treaty. They married in the plainest ceremony the free city had ever seen. No half-year's treasury spent, no glittering court to fawn, only Calith and Maven and a handful of people who had earned the right to stand there through years of proven loyalty. When Toran took her hand, he did not speak of alliances or of what she could do for him. He spoke of who she was, and it was enough, and it was everything, and the mate bond that formed between them that day was warm in a way the old one had never truly been, because it had been chosen rather than arranged, built rather than granted, and no one in all the world could order it severed with a casual word behind a war-room door. Maven lived long enough to see it, and to sit in the place of honor, and to hold, near the end of the evening, the first of the children who would grow up in a house where no one was ever a debt to be discharged. She died 2 winters later, peacefully, in the warm room with her name on it, an old woman who had lost a daughter to the machine and had lived to raise another child free of it, and Ren buried her not with a lock of hair in an empty box, but with her whole self, mourned by a city that had come to love the fierce old kennel mistress from the north. And Ren stood at the grave a long time and thought about culling gates and deer paths and the single act of quiet defiance that had made every other thing possible. She thought, too, about Draven on that cold day, as she rarely allowed herself to. She had heard over the years the reports that trickled south. He had aged badly, they said. He ruled a diminished kingdom with a diminished spirit, and the document signed in his own shaking hand still sat on his desk, and he had never once, in all the years since, attempted to send an assassin south or reclaim by force what he had lost by folly. Perhaps he understood at last that force had never been the answer, that the woman he had ordered killed had beaten him, not despite refusing to use his weapons, but precisely because she had refused them. Perhaps that understanding was its own kind of prison, worse than any Wren could have devised. She did not hate him anymore. Hatred, she had found, required an ongoing investment of the self that she was no longer willing to make in a man who had proven himself so small. She had simply moved beyond him, up and away, to a height from which he was too far below to be worth the effort of contempt. The machine that had eaten women for generations never ran again in the northern valleys. The treaty she had forced Draven to sign held long after both of them were gone, enforced by the weight of the trade she controlled and by the precedent she had set, and the daughters of the Eastern Pax were no longer married off to seal alliances and disposed of when the alliances soured, because their food no longer flowed through a single king's granaries, and their worth was no longer measured by the treaties their bodies could seal. Wren had not set out to change the world. She had set out only to survive, and then to prove her worth, and then to keep some children from starving. But worth proven has a way of rippling outward, and mercy exercised as dominance has a way of teaching the powerful what they could not learn from cruelty, and a woman who refuses to become the thing that broke her has a way of breaking, instead, the thing itself. She lived a long life, Wren Ashvane, the trader who had once been a queen, and she died old and surrounded by people who had chosen her and whom she had chosen, in a house where no one was ever nothing, and it was said in Harogate for generations afterward that the greatest fortune the free city had ever known had been built by a dead woman who walked south out of a fortress in the dark with 40 gold sovereigns sewn into a cloak and a name whispered by an old woman at the edge of a wood. They told her story to their daughters. They told it as a warning to the powerful and a promise to the discarded, and the shape of it never changed because the truth of it never needed to. And the truth was this: worth is not a thing that others grant you, to be given when you are useful and taken back when you are not. It is not a crown that can be placed upon your head by a king and lifted off again by the same hand. It is a thing you build, yourself, out of your own resilience and your own labor and your own refusal to break. And once you have built it, no one can take it from you, because it was never theirs to take. Draven Thornwald believed he could measure Renna's worth and find it spent, and dispose of what remained. He learned, too late and at the cost of everything he ruled, that a person's worth is not his to measure. It never was. It never is. And the ones who understand this, who reclaim themselves after being thrown away and build something the world must reckon with, are the ones who change not only their own fate, but the fate of everyone who comes after them, everyone who learns from their standing, that they too might rise. If this story moved you, if you felt the cold clarity of that moment behind the war room door and the slow, fierce satisfaction of watching a discarded woman rise into a power that no one could revoke, then take a moment before you go. Give this video a like, because it helps stories like this one find the people who need them. Share it with someone in your life who has been made to feel like a debt to be discharged, someone who needs the reminder that their worth was never anyone else's to grant or to take away, because your share might be the thing that reaches them on the very day they need to hear it most. Subscribe to join a community that celebrates exactly this kind of story, the slow burn rise of the underestimated, the quiet triumph of those who refuse to break. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew Wren had truly won? Was it the chair turn in the council chamber, the pen placed in a shaking hand, or the old woman weeping on an overturned bucket in the kennels of the north? I read every one, and I'd love to know which beat landed hardest in your chest.